Hi, everybody. We're just going to give folks a minute to trickle in. I see that counter kind of clicking up. But while we're waiting on everybody to do that, why don't I just start off with a brief introduction in terms of the meetup and in terms of myself. So I have our wonderful panelists here with me. So Kathryn, Joe, and Shana. But before we get into that, we'll give you just a sense of what this all is all about, what this group is all about. So first of all, I'm JJ Colao. I run a public relations firm called Haymaker Group. So we're based here in New York. We work with technology companies, generally venture-backed or public technology companies all over the world. So big companies like Eventbrite or HubSpot, smaller companies as well. The only plug I will make is if you are a communications professional and you're looking to make a move, please don't hesitate to reach out. We would love to speak with you. But outside of that, prior to running a public relations firm, I was a reporter. So we love the media. I actually did overlap with Kathryn in my time at Forbes, where I covered tech, startups, venture capital, kind of that whole world. And started the New York Media Meetup as a means just to keep having these conversations with great journalists about topics that are related either to the business of media or to the craft of media. So today we are here to talk about kind of the craft of journalism and the craft of specifically workplace journalism. And we have an incredible group of panelists who are truly kind of the leading reporters in terms of this topic to discuss all of those issues here with us today. So with that, I will get into just quick panelist introductions and then we'll get into the discussion itself. So first, we have Kathryn Dill, who is joining us from the Wall Street Journal headquarters, which is very exciting. So Kathryn is a reporter covering careers and the workforce at the Wall Street Journal. She previously spent time at CNBC, where she was a careers editor and a senior work editor. And I mentioned before that at my alma mater, Forbes. So recent articles by include some coverage of remote work and how that affects diversity and hiring, also 4-day work weeks, and of course, quiet quitting. So we will get into quiet quitting and kind of the ubiquity of that topic in a little bit as well. You will see it as a commonality here. And then we also have from Bloomberg, Joe Constantz, who is also joining us from New York. So Joe is a future of work reporter at Bloomberg, had some previous stints at the New York Times and Plus One. And recent articles from Joe include coverage of the Seattle Mariners work from the ballpark promotion, which was very cool, high heel injuries, and also quiet quitting. And then, of course, we have Shana Lebowitz Gaynor, who is joining us from Insider, where she also, of course, covers career development and workplace culture. Shana is, in addition to her work as a reporter at Insider, the author of the just released book called Don't Call It Quits, which is all about how to create a more fulfilling job experience without quitting your job. So recent coverage includes articles about how first-time founders can hire top talent, the advantages of starting a career during a recession, and of course, quiet quitting, which is just all the rage these days. And again, we will get into that in a bit, but I want to start a little bit more broadly before we do that. So the first question I want to ask each of you is, workplace is a very broad topic. However we want to kind of slice and dice it or define it, career development, you name it. And there's sort of multiple equally valid ways to cover it. So this is a long way of asking, how do you define your beat? Sort of what is a story for you? And maybe Kathryn, we'll start off with you and we can kind of go around to the other panelists and go from there.
Sure. Thanks for having us. how do I define my beat? I mean, one of the great things about covering workforce is that everybody, almost everybody, has a job, wants a better job, is quiet quitting their current job. And so even when you work at publications that are often geared towards, like when we worked at Forbes, it's a great way to reach parts of the audience that maybe aren't necessarily, not everybody is reading investing coverage if they are maybe in an entry-level job or thinking about starting a career. And so it's sort of an exciting vantage point within a business publication. And the way I really think of it, lots of my stories start with a piece of economic data. That's often a way in for me, the quits rate, or what, how a piece of economic data changed month to month, anomalies. I look for things that are unexpected or that economists get excited about or can't immediately explain, and then take a look a couple months later often at what happened. And really, though, what lets for me, that you're really onto a story is when you can find rank and file workers that are experiencing that. That's what's really, really important. You can get a lot of talking heads, you can get a lot of executives, professors, they all bring great insight. But once you've got rank and file workers, you really know that something is genuinely happening, and often you think it's happening like this, and it's actually happening kind of like this, and it's kind of workers that can help you build that out. So really, what workers are experiencing is kind of how I like to think of my beat. I'm interested to
Yeah.
hear how everyone else approaches it too.
So Kathryn, it sounds like you sort of start with macroeconomic data and then either validate or invalidate, that data, those stated larger trends through anecdotes, through stories from folks on the ground. Is that kind of a fair framing?
Yeah, that is often the case. Sometimes I start with something I've experienced or something my friends are talking about at dinner. That's one of the great things on the workforce beat, is you can kind of be sourcing constantly, and people love to tell you about their jobs, and you should write a story about this thing that happened to me, I think is probably something that happens to us even more than people on other beats. So yeah, often I start with a hook that's like a piece of data, but sometimes I'll notice, a couple of workers talking about something and think, I wonder if this is bigger. I wonder if there's data that supports it. So I guess it can kind of go in either direction. Yeah.
That's great. How about you, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with what Kathryn said. I think lays it out really well. I find myself doing very similar things in terms of like looking at the big data points that you get, and then also just kind of like keeping your ears always open to like what folks are saying. Just even like at the park last week, I remember I was reading and hearing somebody talk about their return to office mandate, and I just kind of like, you're always just on the lookout for those sorts of things. But I think for my beat specifically, future work is such a broad thing, and it can mean so many different things. And it's also kind of impossible to fully fulfill that mandate because nobody knows what the future is going to look like. But you can look at trend lines, and you can kind of try to be constantly thinking about the way where things are heading in different kind of thematic areas. And so looking at and especially during the pandemic, when so much was there has been just so much upheaval pretty much overnight, and we're still trying to figure out where all the chips are going to land and how things are going to work themselves out. So just keeping tabs on I feel like a lot of future of work reporters in the past couple of years have started just looking at return to office. I mean, that's the big thing. That's the big thing that everyone is, always coming back to and are interested in. But I'm also thinking about, slower moving trends like AI and automation and seeing where that goes. We saw so many more people turning to self-employment and starting businesses, and the continuing trend towards freelancing. So just kind of trying to keep finger on the pulse, and how things are moving forward in so many different ways. So that's a long-winded way of saying just trying to keep track of lots of different things at once.
Awesome. And Shana, I know you have a little bit of a different slant in terms of the fact that I think a lot of your coverage is kind of maybe lesson driven and instructive for folks who are grappling with these questions in their own career. So I guess one, is that fair? And two, would love to hear about how you think about your beat and how you define a story.
Thank you for asking. And I'll admit that you cut out for 1 second. So you said it's less driven by something, but I didn't hear what the something was.
I was mentioning that it's often driven by sort of lessons that folks, the readers can draw from, in terms of their own careers.
That makes sense. Yeah, I think that's an accurate assessment. And I really appreciate what both the other panelists just said, about the fact that most people, and certainly most of our audiences, either they have a job or they really want a job or they really don't want a job and are trying to figure out how to make that happen. And that you can pick up pieces of stories just from listening to eavesdropping on other people's conversations. I will say, lately I've sort of changed the way I think about my beat and the workplace beat in general. I've been thinking a lot about ambition and what that means now, what it used to mean, and what it will mean in the coming years. I mean, I think I like to think that I think all of us write for ambitious readers, but I also think that for some people that means, I guess in the more traditional sense, ascending to a position of power and influence and making a lot of money. And then for other people, it means, getting into a position where they can craft the kind of, work-life balance, so to speak, they want, so that they can spend time on their hobbies and time on their job and time with their family. And their ambition is to do that. And so I think of myself and my coverage as exploring that. And to your point, to someone's point about, where stories come from, and this is not specific to the ambition beat, but I often, it's not very quantitative, but I often just have this sense that something is wrong, something is or not right, or there's a piece of the story missing here, and that's sort of what motivates me to ping my editor and say, I think we should write a story or look into writing a story on this workplace topic.
So this is a bit of a different direction in terms of the line of questioning here, and from where I sit as kind of a PR practitioner, it feels to me like this kind of coverage has really grown in recent years, and organizations have invested a lot in terms of fulfilling the demand for this kind of coverage and the interest. And it makes sense in terms of what you said, Kathryn, about how just broadly relevant these topics are. Everybody has a job. Not everybody is interested in what the bond market is doing, that sort of thing. So I would love to hear about your perception of your own organization's view on these topics and this beat, and how that view has changed maybe in the past couple of years, and how you expect it to change going forward. And we can start with whoever may want to start.
Yeah, I can go first. And I'll just say that I think at Bloomberg, we just started our Future of Work team in the past year. And we're actually gearing up for our launch, which will be coming later this month, of the official vertical. And it's going to be branded Work Shift. That's our kind of the name of the vertical. So we're really excited about it, and it just goes to show, yeah, exactly what you were just saying, JJ. It's definitely, we've seen a lot of interest, especially again, all the upheaval that we've seen during the pandemic in terms of how we think about work, how we relate to work, and how work gets done. And so at Bloomberg, it's we now have this dedicated team. It's a small team, but we, in our newsroom, we're very much always working with other teams, other reporters, because the beat just intersects so many different subject areas. So we're really trying to leverage the entire newsroom and coordinate all of our efforts. So it's definitely an exciting time. And I just, I just see more energy going towards it in the future.
Shana, I know you've been a Business Insider, or insider, I should say, for it looked like 7 years. So I'd be curious to hear your view of how, this topic has changed and the company's approach to it over those years.
I appreciate that question because I have indeed seen, insiders' approach to covering everything change over the past, because it has been like 7.5 years. There you go. And in terms of covering, the workplace and careers, we always had a careers team. Now it's sort of split into the careers and leadership team and a bunch of reporters sort of on the beat. But I think now we're sort of like digging into topics that either we didn't dig into a few years ago or didn't exist, however many years ago. And that's really like, even something as seemingly, general and ever present as burnout. I mean, my coworkers and I, in the past year or 2 years, we've all sort of hit the burnout, hit that topic from different angles and different perspectives. And we talked to different segments of the US and the global workforce. And I mean, when I first started, I think, I remember writing a story maybe about a paper on that was not really related to burnout specifically. It was more like, your work performance will diminish after a certain number of hours. But now we're sort of like getting into the more emotional or psychological piece of it. I'm not sure exactly how to characterize it, but things that we just sort of touched on maybe more superficially or tangentially like 5, 6, 7 years ago.
So kind of going a layer deeper on these topics that were maybe covered on a surface level in years past.
I think that's right. And I think it's a welcome change too.
Yeah. Kathryn, how about the Journal?
Yeah, I mean, I was really sort of, thrilled and gratified when I joined the Journal to see that workplace coverage is really, referred to and certainly treated as core to what we do here. I think that hasn't always been the case everywhere. As companies or as media properties have grown workforce coverage and the teams that do it, years ago I remember being on like a 2-person team and I had to have multiple other jobs because this wasn't like a thing that you could just be focused on. Whereas now and I think this was true then, but now we realize there's more stories than even among the three of us and the teams that we're on, there's more to write about than you could ever really get at. And I think the pandemic only proved that out further. We were sort of joking like, it's rare to have, I was new to the Journal when the pandemic started, and we were sort of laughing like, it's rare to have a global news event where the work team is right out in front on the coverage. But of course, like work changed immediately, beyond health and science. It was like the next big front that was affecting everyone throughout the pandemic. And it's certainly an area that we've seen transformed over the last couple of years. And so I think the interest and the fallout is only going to continue to be strong. And certainly that's how the Journal has viewed it. And, as Joe said, we work across the newsroom with all our other teams and it's exciting, like for those of us who cover work, I think it's always interesting. It's maybe not always exciting. And for the last several years, it really has been.
Just to put numbers on it to the extent that any of you can, do you have a sense of, the number of new reporters that are being hired by your organizations to work on these topics or anything else that can just give us sort of a sense of the expansion of these teams and newsrooms? And if not, that's okay too.
I'm not sure I can give you a hard number, JJ, but I do know, maybe this is a cop-out answer, but I'd say I work on like the broader team on which I sit. Everybody kind of covers work and careers, even if they're technically on small business or technically they are on even real estate or leadership. Everybody kind of touches on this topic in their reporting, and I don't think that was true a few years ago. I think it was more like a handful of us covered the topic pretty narrowly, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Joe or Kathryn, do you have any sense?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say so. Right now we have 3 dedicated reporters, 1 dedicated editor. So that doesn't sound like a ton, but that's more that we didn't have any dedicated, people on this beat before. So it's definitely an investment in that direction. And, as Shana was saying, there's so many people who are on different teams who we work with all the time. So it's kind of, we have this like natural extension of our team into the folks who are covering the economy, to real estate folks covering return to office, to health and the health team. So there's so many different teams and people who we work with on a regular basis that we just kind of consider like extensions of our core team.
Yeah, I don't have a great number. I mean, similarly, our team has grown over the time I've been here, and even when I've been here almost exactly 3 years, and even when I started, when you start a new job and you go around you figure out who had it before, and you go around being like, oh, I have, Sally's old job, like I'm sitting in her, like I had a new job and a new head they had created on my team, which in a newsroom is exciting.
Kathryn, I will say from where I sit, I knew certainly of you and of Chip Cutter. And now when I see a Wall Street Journal kind of workplace related article, often I'm surprised that it's a byline that is neither of you and it's somebody else. So from where I sit, it feels like there are more names being associated with these topics than there once were.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
Okay. So my next question is sort of about, to the extent that you're aware of it, I guess, audience reaction and interest. And I won't yet get into quiet quitting, but I would assume that a big part of the reason for the popularity of that topic is that people want to read about it for whatever reason. So putting that topic aside, do you have a sense of what really kind of drives interest among your respective audiences in terms of the types of topics that you cover, and maybe what you kind of wish would land or generate interest, but in fact doesn't? So yeah, just kind of digging for any trends you might be able to share in that respect. Kathryn, I'm going to go back to you to start, if that's okay.
I've written a bunch about, I mean, this is like an example. I don't know if I have a better like survey answer on this, but I've written a bunch about different occupations, and that often gets a big response. I wrote about teachers earlier this year, not just leaving the profession, but becoming, in a war for talent, this like really attractive pool to other employers. And that was definitely my best read story in the time I've been at the Journal. And I still, both in numbers and in reader response to me, I still hear from people on that story. And I think that, I had a similar experience writing about hospitality workers during the pandemic. And I think the things that really zero into occupations get very much at that nexus of a big change, of pressure points, of people saying, like, thank you, we say this among ourselves, but like, we want, it's good to know that like other people are hearing about it on the news, or maybe now my boss will read this and understand some of the problems we're having. It's sort of a sweet spot for a lot of those things, at least in my experience.
That's interesting. So the kinds of stories that unearth trends within just different verticals, different occupations, and sort of, it seems like occasionally validate, the issues that folks within those occupations are having.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly the pandemic has driven a lot of, occupational transformation, because you had whole job categories that were brought down to zero, in March of 2020, and then had to rebuild. And a lot of those people found something else to do in the meantime. And so that was certainly a rich vein in recent years.
Yeah, I will say your teacher retiring article hit right when my mother retired from teaching. So it certainly felt like it was on the mark from, our perspective.
We got it right.
Yeah. Joe, I know you unmuted.
Yeah. It's funny how that's like the new social cue, like you're going to start talking. Yeah, I think what has kind of surprised me in just like the endurance, and I kind of talked about it at the beginning, was we kind of started talking about RTO and that whole will we, won't we sort of thing, but that the interest in that topic has endured and just continued. I think a lot of people are just always curious what other folks are doing, other company leaders, how are you going about this? And also, who has mandates, what's kind of the news on that front. So I think that's something that has always does well, and people always want to read about. And then I'd say the other thing is kind of when you can get at points of tension with, this evolving landscape and in how we're figuring out hybrid work and where it's not working. I think people, always want to read about where there's conflict, tension. That's just a good story. And also, tension in other ways as well. My colleague wrote about recruiters getting frustrated with Gen Z. And I think that always kind of strikes a chord, deserved or not, people have feelings. So I think when that's kind of reflected in the coverage, people like to read it and they have a lot to say.
It's so funny and predictable that the next generation, Gen Z, has now become the punching bag that millennials were, 8 years ago. It continues. It's nice to pass the baton. Shana, how about you? I know Insider often pays kind of close attention to these details, so it'd be interesting to hear about how your audiences react to different pieces.
Yes, you're right. Insider is pretty or tries to be pretty closely attuned to audience engagement and figuring out what that means. So I actually just wanted to pick up on something Kathryn mentioned about your teacher article, which I thoroughly enjoyed, by the way. I like how you said that they were like using I think you said they were using the skills that they had to go into like different professions that offered them, anyway, I'm butchering it, but I loved it. So, I think it's interesting, and I also think this is true outside of workplace coverage specifically, that writing about what seems like a niche area or a niche community often, it performs well in terms of how many people read your article, and it also just like those people tend to be very vocal and they're sharing it with their friends and they have a lot of opinions. And I say this specifically earlier in the pandemic, I wrote about, it was an investigation of sorts into the Society for Human Resource Management. And, I had been covering HR very closely, and I had heard that this organization, which is the largest HR organization in the world, was having personnel problems of its own, which, according to the many people I spoke to, turned out to be true. So, all this to say that, a lot of people, in fact, most people, like friends of mine, when I mentioned that I was writing the story or I had published the story, they had no idea what I was talking about. But for the people who did know what I was talking about, it really, really mattered. And they were very, engaged, so to speak, in that story.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's SHRM, right? Is sort of how I know them, which they're a huge deal in kind of the HR world, and have their own, media properties as well. And certainly familiar with that organization, and they feel like a real node and sort of a real, I don't know, influential brand in the world of HR. So I can understand why that struck a chord in that way. I'm going to segue a little bit, but I'm curious to hear about who are the most valuable sources for you, because often, there are folks in HR departments or quote unquote HR experts who I'm sure would love to speak with you all day, every day. But maybe those folks are valuable from time to time, maybe not. So would just be curious to hear about how you get, all of the great information that you get and who's most useful in that sense. And Shana, if it's okay, maybe we'll start with you and kind of reverse.
Absolutely. I was thinking about it now because you just asked the question, and I am inclined to say that it's not a specific person who gives the best, most useful information. Sometimes I'll talk to an HR leader or practitioner, and they'll say something about trends that they're seeing or the organization where they work. And then I'll kind of do a little reporting on that industry or organization, and it doesn't really bear out what they said. Sometimes it does, and sometimes that suggests that there might be a story, not because the person is lying or even because they're out of touch, the HR rep, maybe just because different types of people in different positions at the same organization experience things in different ways and perceive things differently. So that suggests that there's more nuance to an issue than perhaps one might think.
Joe, how about you?
Yeah, I'd say, definitely the workplace consultants, HR consultants are great, especially when they have some good new data that speaks to something that people are interested in. But I think, for me, often it's just spending time on Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, and just seeing what people are talking about. And if something like keeps coming up, like the quiet quitting thing, like you know that there's something there, and it can be niche, but you can follow up on it. And also, I find that folks who are active on social media, often they enjoy sharing their story, and they enjoy talking about whatever it is that they care about, and so they can be great sources as well. But also, yeah, again, just coming back to like roommates, friends, I often, whenever my roommate is talking about something that's going on at work, I'm always kind of asking like a little, a few more questions, just like to really drill down into what's happening and whether it's something that other people are experiencing too. So always trying to kind of connect the dots.
Over to you, Kathryn.
I agree with everything that's been said already. I would say, yeah, the rank and file workers are usually the most useful to me in really like fleshing out a story. Often people that look at there are people at different points of the emergence of workforce trends, like people who do retraining or reskilling. They're often insightful about, there's a couple of people I can call and just be like, who are you seeing more of? Are you seeing people change careers? What skills do people have that they're not using, or what skills do they need? That can often point you in a strong direction. But and I think it's worth noting that at least in my experience, I'd be interested to hear Shana and Joe how you feel, but like in my experience covering careers and the workforce, it's a shift, and I think a good one, that you can't run an article now without talking to real people. Like you used to be able to put through an article with a consultant and a CEO, and you can't anymore. And I think that's excellent. And it makes everything a lot more work, but it's just so much better for the reporter and the reader and the overall outcome. And I think that's a really positive development in what we do.
That makes sense. So it sounds like the HR experts, the folks in those departments are helpful, but really the essential element for most articles, if not all, it sounds like is speaking to real rank and file workers who can both validate, some of these hypotheses or invalidate them, as well as provide maybe a different, perspective. So I want to go in a bit of a different direction here, but it strikes me that the three of you, in that you cover this topic and generally have for many years, have a pretty unique window in terms of the American workforce as a whole, and in terms of workplace policies and HR departments and that whole world. And so I guess I'm curious if there's anything that has kind of surprised you as you've delved into this world more deeply, or anything that you think is misunderstood about either of those subjects relative to sort of the larger population. And I don't know who to start with for this one. So maybe we can get a volunteer, because I know it's kind of a loaded question. Not loaded, but multifaceted.
I'll start. There's 8 million ways to answer this question, I think, but because we've mentioned data a number of times, the data that frames the workforce is really hard to understand often. The government data, the way it's collected, the way it's presented. I mean, I was just thinking about this last week because I was on vacation the day the jobs report came out, and I was with my mom and happened to say to her, like, oh, this is so weird, like I'm on vacation and it's the jobs report, and it was on TV, and she was like, now when they say new jobs, what is that? And so we really got into it about what this means, and and I was like, but if you look at JOLTS, it means something totally different. And that's sort of, I think, the case. There's all these like big numbers that we use to frame these conversations, but what they actually mean and how they're collected are very complicated and often hard to compare. And then there's just like a universe of squishy survey data about how workers feel. And you sort of have to decide how you want to use it, how you want to interact with it, what you trust. And of course, I think these things are true across beats. I think personal finance reporters would say the same thing, and VC reporters would say the same thing. But again, there's just something about jobs and employment that everybody feels personally connected to, and that they're an expert in. And so you've got to bring something more to the party, I think.
That's a great answer. So the data is kind of weird and hard to understand, especially to a lay person. Shana and Joe, how about you?
I'm almost forgetting what the question was, but I seem to have an answer in my head, so I'll just roll with it. But I remember, back when I started reporting in earnest on human resources, I remember, like, no one understands what anybody's job is, but I didn't really understand like what exactly HR was. And I certainly wasn't expecting it to be very interesting. And as I started doing the reporting and developing more of like a roster of sources and really learning more about it, I found that it was in fact very interesting, which, I'm sure there are plenty of HR people listening to me right now and being very insulted, but it is very interesting. It's if you think about it, and now I do, it's just like, how do you keep people at your company or if you're a consultant, people in your sphere happy and engaged and performing well and thriving, and those are like very, very complicated things to achieve. They're important, but they're complicated, and so there's so many there's like so much material there to think and talk about and to write about. And so it really surprised me, like how rich and wonderful that world was and is.
Yeah, I guess the first thing, I'm sure there are, so many things. If I sat with this question for a longer, I would come up with, a dozen different things. But one thing I think that has struck me is just how there are certain things that are still completely like we haven't found good answers to them, or we haven't discovered kind of the right way of doing things. I think one thing that I think about is the Times had that recent long story about productivity trackers and tracking, and it just kind of brings up this which has been going on, and of course has increased over the pandemic, but it brings up the point that we don't really have a great way of measuring how productive somebody is. We can measure input, we can measure how much time they sit at their desk, but that doesn't translate into output. And that's a lot harder to measure in a way that is consistent for everyone. And so I think it's just kind of surprising, and like Rich in the way that Shana was saying is there are so many, it's open-ended in so many ways, and there's so many things that I think that, we're still kind of developing best understandings and best practices around that, especially with all of everything that's happened in the past couple of years. I think, there's just a lot more development that we're going to be seeing.
That's all very helpful. So I do want to make sure we have some time to get to audience questions, and we have a couple lined up. But before we do that, I have at least one or two more questions that I selfishly want to get to. So the first of those is kind of sticking with this, I don't know, big meaty influencer framing here. Is how do you expect the workforce to change in America, or the workplace to change in America over the coming years? Do you think the remote thing is going to stay? Does this thing have legs? What else is likely to evolve? What should people expect? So I guess I'm sort of asking you to put on your predictive hats, and Joe, I know, with future of work, that's in your title. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. And Joe, do you mind if we start with you?
Yeah, sure thing. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think the remote thing is here to stay. I think we're also, again, as I was kind of saying in the previous question, we're still in just like the first inning in terms of figuring out how everything is going to work. And, the best way to manage in a hybrid environment, the best way to go about, what's the right mix, the way offices should be designed. So I think we will be seeing I think we'll be figuring this out for the next few years. I think it's going to take a while. And I think that workers of all stripes will continue to kind of assert this newfound power. That's not something that I don't think, talked about too much so far, but this idea that we are experiencing such a tight labor market, and it's just continuing even with kind of looming fears of recession in such a way that I think that employers will have to figure out how to, cater to some of the demands for flexibility that people have. And so I think that's definitely we're going to see that continue.
I'm going to maybe simplify this a little bit. Do you think the job of the average American is going to get better in the next 20 years or worse? And whatever you want to put into that. Yeah, Shana, go ahead.
I'm just going to take the contrarian post here and say I'm not sure it's going to get better or worse. It might stay about the same, which I know sounds quite crazy in light of the fact that people are moving to remote and hybrid work in droves and quitting their jobs and questioning the meaning of life, and all these things have changed. But I also think that fundamentally, I mean, people still generally need to work to make money, and a lot of people hate their jobs and want better ones, or they feel okay about their jobs and want a better one. And it's hard to show up and fight with your boss. I mean, I think a lot of these things will stay the same. And the only thing that I will add to that is maybe in the direction of better is that I think people are going to have more options than they did in years past. So like, instead of continue doing this job or, stay in this industry or, have nothing to do. I mean, I think there are many ways to like parlay your skills and your experience into different types of roles. So that's good.
Right. So more fluidity within the job market, which does strike me as a good thing. And who knows how that nets out with whatever else is going to happen in terms of automation and globalization, whatever, but more fluidity does seem like it benefits the average worker.
Yes.
Kathryn, what's your take?
I'm gonna do something I've always wanted to do and just like answer the question not exactly as you asked it. Which
That's what
is
we
that I
teach
don't know
people
if it's
in PR.
yeah, like there we go. I don't know if it's gonna get better or worse. I think there is the average American's job. I think there is reason to believe that from the reporting we already have, that the impact of work on mental health is going to continue to increase. I think that as companies and employers struggle to figure out hybrid work and people feel either stress related to returning to the office or the isolation of not returning to the office, or struggle with that balance, and things like, as Joe mentioned, productivity trackers and the technology that we're reliant upon to bring us together proliferate. I think there's reason to believe that that will continue to impact mental health, and I'm curious in bigger ways, and I'm curious to see what those are.
I am too. I don't really have a view on this, but I'm not the expert. Okay, so with that, I have one last question, and then we'll get into sort of the audience questions, which is, why did quiet quitting become such a big deal? And it seems like it's still happening. And I will be honest with you, I think I understand the concept. I'm not sure I understand why it sort of caught fire the way that it did. So I would love to hear it from your perspectives, you all being the folks who are writing these articles and kind of, responding, I would imagine, in some way to the demand for different takes on this topic. So Joe, do you mind if we go to you to start off?
Yeah, sure. So I and I'm really interested to hear what you guys think, Kathryn and Shana, but I have like 3 things that kind of come to mind immediately for why it's become such a thing. And I think first is part of it is that it's the definition is inconsistent, and there's so much debate around what it even means. So that kind of like spawns its own, like however many tweets and TikToks and posts about it and articles, just trying to like lay out the groundwork, and people arguing over that. So I think that's a lot of it already. And I kind of compared it to the other day. I was thinking about it in terms of like the blue gold dress thing. Is it blue? Is it gold? Like, is this employees being lazy? Is this, work-life boundaries? Like, except for, there's like a dozen different colors it could be. So there's that. And then I think also the whole like putting quitting in there just makes it feel like very subversive and like cool in this way that, people like the idea of doing something wrong against the rules and getting away with it, and hearing about other people doing that. It's kind of like skipping school or something. I don't know. So I think people are attracted to that. And then I think it's easy to get mad about as well, in terms of, people slacking off. So I think it just brings up all of this stuff. And then also it's just like the alliteration, like, come on, that's just so much catchier than like fulfilling your job duties according to expectations. Like, you can never make something like that, catch fire. So I think a combination of those things. But I'm, again, interested to hear what you guys think.
That's a really good analysis. Shana, do you have anything to add in terms of the popularity of this topic?
I do, which is that we recently learned at Insider that quiet quitting, the concept of it originated in my colleague's article. Aki Ito, she wrote an article, I think back in March, I'm gonna have to double check that, but about coasting culture, also alliterative. But somebody she quoted in the article mentioned, I think, something that he was quitting quietly, and somebody talked about it on TikTok, and the word spread from there. So I have to tip my hat to Aki, but I don't have much more profound to say than that.
I mean, that's pretty profound. We just got to the bottom of this. Like, we just discovered the genesis of this term, which I think is a huge deal. So yeah, lots of credit to Aki and to her source on this, I guess.
Indeed.
Kathryn, what's your take?
I was just thinking that I wonder if there's any other beat where people are so hungry to like coin phenomena. Because we've had some big ones on the work beat. I mean, the Great Resignation being the other one that really stuck. But every once in a while, you can sort of tell in an interview that somebody's like trying for a new one, and obviously they don't all land. So I think that's pretty exciting insight from Shana. I mean, I think, Joe gave a great analysis. I would say there's also like one of the sort of elements of a blockbuster on this beat very often is that there's like a kids these days element to this, which of course, as we've discussed with, some of these generational takes, is not quite right. Some of the people in the most viral TikToks are in their 40s. And even when we looked at reader response, in the comments on some of our quiet quitting stories, we see lots of comments from retirees who, go in on this as, I can't believe that people would do this. And by the end of the comment, express some regret for things that they missed out on during their career, because they were really focused on going above and beyond. And so I do think it offers truly something for everyone in a really kind of unique way, and lets people feel either sort of like celebratory or judgmental, which is always fun when you're a reader. So, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add one more thing, but thank you, Shana, for that like little bit of history. I think that's so interesting. The other thing I was going to just say is something we also talked about earlier, and you talked about, Shana, is just like the burnout. It kind of hits on burnout in this way that I think most everyone can relate to. So I think that's just one more piece of it.
That was great. I'm really glad I asked that question, because I think it's illustrative in many ways of the beat as a whole. And Kathryn, as you mentioned, just this world kind of being so attractive to folks who want to create categories and slogans and that sort of thing. I totally see that, in our own work. And it's interesting to see how these terms can go from somebody kind of innocently in an interview riffing on this phenomenon to now multiple headlines in the biggest business publications in the world for, I don't know, at least, 2 weeks straight at this point. So to go from, that little spark to this big fire is pretty fun. With that, I do want to get into some of the audience questions. So there are a couple in here, and I'm going to start with the last one, which comes from Tim. So Tim is asking about basically what we've discussed in some ways ad nauseum since March of 2020, which is how are employers working to curb in-office spreads, not only of COVID, but cold, flu, asthma, et cetera. So, sort of around the return to office, which again has been going on now for, I don't know, as soon as we had a pandemic and we left the office, we were talking about returning to it. But it does feel like some of those concerns about sanitation or, air filtering or whatever, like they feel less salient these days. I'm curious how it looks from your perspectives, and maybe we don't have to go all around the horn here, but just one or two folks if you want to weigh in.
I'd jump in and say really quick, I think like you definitely have seen like some of the big banks and other companies have scaled back their like vaccine mandates or like testing regimens. So I think that there is kind of this scale back as a way to say like it's fine now, like we can go back. So I think like there is like a little bit of concern, especially on the part of people who are like immunocompromised or otherwise like still, this is top of mind and a big concern about that. But at the same time, I think I would also say that through the pandemic, we have norms now around like if you're sick at all, like you don't want to come and like give it to people. We have like a infrastructure in place to work from home. So I will say at the same time, like I think that there are stronger norms around like where in the past, maybe you wouldn't have necessarily, you would have powered through with a cold. Now it's, less so the case.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it does seem like some things have fundamentally changed in terms of culture and in terms of around the office practices. Certainly, there's a lot more hand sanitizer than there used to be, and folks are probably better about staying home. But maybe some of the crazy things that we thought were going to take place, I mean, really, in some ways, as simple as like masking in the office and all the, UV light things, probably not as common as maybe they once seemed like they would be. I do want to move on to one of the more recent questions that an audience member put in, because it addresses a topic that we haven't discussed and is a big part of, I think, the workplace beat, which is DEI. So in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, do we think companies are actually following through on this? I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but there's been a lot of lip service in terms of this topic. It does seem like there has been some real improvement, but I'm curious about how substantive and enduring you think all of that will be and has been.
I mean, I can, from my own reporting, I've in this context, I've written about companies using, remote work to sort of diversify their talent pipelines, which was something we heard a lot about in 2020, and we've sort of been, trying to take a look at we tried to do sort of a report card on that earlier this year, and it seems that it is happening, but the companies that are really committed to it have discovered that it's not just as simple as like posting a job, saying it can be 100% remote, and finding that you suddenly have a much more diverse talent pool applying for it. It does need to be a little bit more intentional. Sometimes it needs to involve the potential for training or sourcing talent even to apply to those jobs differently than they might have before, or bringing someone into a company and then really like staying alongside them as they acclimate. And this is something that's not just related to racial diversity, but that also gets to some of the occupational shifts where we've seen people move from blue collar work to upskilled office or more corporate roles, which brings its own set of challenges. And so hiring and onboarding is an area that's long been a minefield for companies, I think. And so as they try to do these more complicated things, fulfill some of these goals that they've talked about really publicly, I think some of them are finding that it's more complex than like I said, just posting a remote job. But we're also seeing some of them, start to deliver. So just possibly Joe and Shana can give a fuller answer on that.
I'll just say, I agree with what Kathryn said, that many organizations and employers are realizing that it is a more complex process than perhaps they once thought. I also will say that, and on a more pessimistic note, I tend to see, it's a little bit preaching to the choir, I suppose, writing about these sorts of issues. I think that many organizations are truly making efforts in the direction of creating workplaces that are more equitable and more inclusive. And then there's the rest of the corporate America, which is kind of not doing anything. And so I hope that will change. I'd like it to.
I think that's a very good reminder that the coasts, the places, candidly, that my business often works with in New York and in San Francisco and London, et cetera, not necessarily representative of the rest of the country or the rest of the world. And it doesn't take much to, dip into, I don't know, an energy company in Texas and see the difference. So I think that's a very good point. Like there is probably a real change happening, among 10%, we'll say the top 10%, but there's a much bigger contingent where, change is much slower. So on that bright note, we are at 6 p.m. I do want to make sure that we get you all out of here on time, because you've been very generous with your time, and we really appreciate all of the insights that you've shared with us for this last half hour. So quick kind of virtual round of applause for our great panelists and folks in the New York Media Meetup audience. We hope we see you again sometime soon. We will have this video on YouTube within a week or so, but thank you all again in the meantime, Kathryn, Joe, and Shana. It's been fantastic. So we really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome. Bye, everybody.